What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin along with John Krofsik. And John, I don't know about you and your culinary skills, but like my carpentry, I don't measure twice and cut once, so to speak. When I master the kitchen, what I do is I just throw all these ingredients together and hopefully they'll come together in a way that is not overwhelming for one spice or one additive versus another. Why rely on the numbers when instinct alone will do?
Well, my problem is that I don't stick to the
recipe.
I think if I stuck to the recipe, I'd be good, but or if I don't have something that's in the recipe, I substitute. And it usually gets me in trouble.
Sometimes it comes out so well, and you say, "Why did I just not, sprinkle it? Why did I actually measure it and use a quarter cup of this and that? I mean, when I could have just thrown it together."
It usually doesn't work out for me that easily. No.
Well, my wife is incredible at that. I mean, she really goes by her instincts. And I got to say that much of my career in broadcasting, I have used my gut as well as my head, but often my gut. And I've trusted my own instincts that what I was putting together in terms of programming and the like was something that the dogs would eat. I didn't say people would listen to it or watch it, but dogs would eat it. So today, we're going to be talking about analytics and metrics and algorithms and precise forms of measurement. And I would argue, as does our next guest, that we rely upon those things today almost to a fault, John.
Yeah, it's really crazy, analytics. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around how all these numbers are going to tell us the future.
Well, again, what our guest is suggesting through his book, The Tyranny of Metrics, is that we really have become basically held hostage to the numbers, and we don't trust our own instincts, and they will atrophy if we say, well, I'll give it all over to a computer program, let them tell me whether this is a good program to put on the air or whether this is going to work in terms of the way that I'm going forward with a project of mine. And should we give up those human characteristics where we say, I'll bet on this because, well, I've got a mind too.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I like I said, I've been trying to figure out analytics, and they're supposed to make, we're supposed to be able to tell the future, better for buying stocks and everything else.
Well, you heard Rebecca Costa,
yes,
who was on our program,
exactly,
and she looked at these predictive analytics, and they are pretty darn good. However, the question is, are we applying them, even if they're good, even if they're reliable? Are we laying them against every form of performance? And certain things just can't be measured that precisely. Well, the one thing that we worry about putting it against, let's say education, that everything's a number and that our kids come away with a test score in their hands and that defines who they are and what their future is going to be, when in fact there are many different levels of intelligences that we may not be measuring any longer. Then to medicine, business, even government, the military, even philanthropy. Oh, well, let me see. Before I give $10 to this organization, let me look at all the metrics. No. I like this group. I know some of the people involved. I'm going to give them a couple of dollars for their mission. Well, has the tyranny of metrics gone too far? That's what we analyze and dissect today on America Trends. Jerry Muller is with us. He's written a great book called The Tyranny of Metrics. And I'm really fascinated. You identify this cultural pattern in America, and perhaps even beyond America, that you call metric fixation. What is that?
Metric fixation is a perversion of a combination of ideas that in and of themselves sound perfectly plausible. But when you put them together and use them as the sort of guiding organizational tools for judging human performance in organizations, turn out to be dysfunctional. So the three beliefs that metric fixation is based on, again, ideas that seem reasonable when you first hear them, are, first of all, what gets measured gets done. So you hear this all the time from business gurus, and you have since at least the 1980s.
Wasn't that Tom Peters? Didn't he say that?
Tom Peters is the one that made it famous, that's right. So the notion is that you should replace human judgment that's based on experience with standardized measures of performance. What's the success rate of a heart surgeon compared to others, for example? Or in school, how well do the pupils in third grade do on a reading test compared to pupils in other schools? And then the second idea is that people respond to incentives. So you should reward them if the standardized measures are high, and you should punish them if they don't reach their target measures. So it's the idea of pay for performance, or pay and punish for performance, and we can get into some examples of that. And the third idea that's part of this metric fixation is the idea that professionals and institutions become more accountable to the public by taking these standardized measures of performance and making them public in the form of, say, scorecards for hospitals that are based on their mortality rates, or rankings of colleges and universities based on return on investment. So the idea is that you take these three things together. So in policing, for example, you have a standardized measure of, say, the crime rate in some precinct. You make it public, and then you reward and punish. So you reward the precinct captain if the crime rate goes down, and you punish him by not promoting him if the crime rate goes up. And so the book is about how that metric fixation came about, and it looks at a variety of fields, from education to policing to business to medicine, to explain why and when measurement works, and why this combination that I've called metric fixation is so often ineffective or even dysfunctional.
So should we believe the numbers that we read? Because, if I get hit over the head when I walk out of here, it's not going to make me feel any better when I read tomorrow that the crime rate in my city is down substantially. I still got hit over the head.
Right. So the question, it could actually make you feel better if you knew the fact that you got hit over the head was idiosyncratic or unrepresentative. But what sometimes happens is, the police captains are told by the mayor or the police commissioner that the crime rate has to go down 10% before the election. Now, it's actually impossible to make the actual crime rate go down 10% before the election, but what you can do is you can game the metrics, or as they sometimes call it in policing, juke the stats. So you can take crimes that are reported to the police and simply not record them. Or more frequently, you can record them as lesser crimes than they actually are. So assault and battery, in that case that you mentioned, could get listed as some more minor kind of misdemeanor. So there's often it's quite possible, especially when this kind of pressure is put on the police or any public service or any business, to have a wide gap between the reported and publicized metric performance and the actual performance.
Well, you bring up a couple that definitely get my attention all the time. One is healthcare, because I know that there are certain doctors and certain performance measures today that have been built in to some of the reforms that we've seen of late. And I've interviewed a lot of doctors and all, and they're talking about these accountable healthcare organizations. And you really begin to wonder what that means, because a lot of healthcare is really in our own hands. I mean, I can go see a doctor today, and they can do all that they want to do, and then give me a prescription or give me some advice, go out, exercise more, whatever. If I don't follow it, just because I drop dead, God forbid, the next day, that is not their fault necessarily, because so much of it is out of their control.
Right. So that's a bigger issue that my book deals with. and that runs through many different fields. It certainly runs through healthcare. It also runs through education, for example. And to a certain degree, it runs through policing and public safety as well. We tend to want to hold formal institutions accountable, like doctors and hospitals, teachers and schools, police forces. But often, as you suggested, the actual outcomes are beyond the control of those formal institutions. So in the realm of schooling, for example, the performance of students in K-12 education or in college depends in very, very large part not on what the teachers do and not on what the principal does. It depends on who the students are. What sort of a background do they come from? Do they come from families that encourage literacy and numeracy and education? Do they come from families where the parents themselves are bright and accomplished, or the opposite? And very often the outcome of schooling has to do, as I say, with the inputs of schooling.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you can tell me how many books a child has read before the age of 6 or 7, I can often predict how successful they're going to be and how stimulated they were and whether they got to a museum or whatever. So there are so many things that really are hard to reduce to a number, looking in comparison one to the other. And yet you remind us that that's what we're trying to do in many cases.
Yes. So if I can go back to health for one moment, because it's such an important area. As you say, most of people's health depends on things like what and how they eat, how much exercise they get, whether they live in an area where there's a lot of misuse of firearms, what the nature of their sexual activity is like, and so on. And, the biggest problems in American healthcare, by and large, are diabetes and heart disease, and those both have to do with those issues of diet and exercise and so on. So there's some doctors can try to encourage people to eat better and get more exercise and keep guns out of the house and so on. But ultimately, what the level of performance is going to be in health depends a lot more on what goes on outside of the doctor's office and outside of the hospital. So there are many cases like that, but that's part of the attraction of metric fixation and part of its distortive effects. It makes it seem that if we just have the right formula, if we just have the right magic bullet to incentivize the hospitals properly, or incentivize the teachers properly, or incentivize the police properly, we're going to get much better outcomes. But what we actually get often are better nominal outcomes, but not real outcomes, because those figures have been distorted in one way or another. And then you mentioned one of the other big problems with this notion of measuring standardized performance, and that is so many of the really important things that go on in almost any organization are things that either can't be measured or that are very, very difficult to measure. And the propensity of people who focus on standardized measurement is to think that, first of all, only the things that you can measure are really important, and that the things that you can't measure aren't, and the tendency often to think that the things that are most easily measured are the things that one ought to measure first. So in almost any organization, things like character qualities, like mentoring more junior colleagues, or cooperating with colleagues, or getting along with clients and customers, and so on. Those things are hard to measure, certainly especially the mentoring and the cooperation, but often that's the difference between an organization that really works well and an organization that doesn't.
Absolutely. And Jerry, I want to get into a case that for those of us of a certain generation, this really will ring true. And that's the fact that even in War and Peace, this idea of metrics comes into play. And I'll never forget Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, and he was trying to tally up our success in Vietnam and get us to invest more and more blood and treasure based on body counts. Go through that with us.
So Robert McNamara plays an important role in the book, in the sense that he was somebody who, most people don't know this, but he was a kind of prodigy of accounting. I think he was appointed to be professor of accounting at Harvard when he was about 24 years old. And he took that kind of accounting mentality and imported it to a wider range of organizations. So first he went to work for a number of years for the Ford Motor Company, where he instituted this culture of metric fixation, basically. And then, of course, he became Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. By the way, the fact that somebody could go from being the head of, not being head, but being a leading official in a car company to being the Secretary of Defense is self-evidence of this kind of managerialism that's often responsible for metric fixation. The notion is that management is not really a matter of expertise and experience in the particular organization. It's really a matter of techniques that you can transfer from one organization to another, and those techniques are often these metric techniques. So to get back to McNamara, when he became Secretary of Defense, he famously placed a great deal of emphasis on this standardized measure of accountability, namely body counts. And the notion was this was a way of keeping track of how the American war effort was going in Vietnam, and the higher the body count of the enemy, that is the higher number of enemy killed, and its ratio to the number of Americans killed, or South-Vietnamese army killed, the greater would be the measure of success. And that had all sorts of distortive effects. First of all, it couldn't measure the most important thing in war, at least in a war of that sort, and that was the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. So the most important thing couldn't be measured, but he wanted to measure it anyway. Secondly, he made it known that the promotion of generals would depend in part on these body counts. So that had a number of dysfunctional effects. For one thing, a lot of generals or officers below them would simply fudge the numbers, that is, inflate the body counts. Secondly, in some cases, American soldiers, in an attempt to increase the body count, seem to have killed unarmed civilians. And thirdly, gathering the information itself is often expensive. This is a general problem with metric fixation. And in this case, there were soldiers that we know of who were killed going out into the field to count the bodies. So, and McNamara in general was responsible for the importation of this managerial ideology into the American military as a whole, and then it spread to a much wider range of organizations as well.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us. Yeah. Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter. That's right. We're the World turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well,
Not
you can
us, though.
direct
We
message
have real
us
news.
at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends. When we look at this fixation with metrics, what are the worst downside effects? Is it that everybody begins to game the system, or that we forget about some of those touch things that judgment and human contact and relationships really means, and that is something you can't measure? What gets lost in the sauce most often?
Mm-hmm. So there are several kinds of typical problems or dysfunctions. One is that people sometimes will respond to what gets measured, and they will focus their efforts and their attention on what gets measured and rewarded at the expense of all sorts of other aspects of the organization that are necessary for the functioning of the organization, but don't get rewarded. And sometimes organizations respond to that by having more and more and more metrics to try to measure every possible thing that should be done in the organization. That ends up taking more and more time to input the metrics and to analyze the metrics and so on. So the first problem is that sometimes people will actually focus on the things that are measured at the expense of all the other important things that aren't measured. And one finds that, for example, in the public schools as a result of legislation in recent decades, it's No Child Left Behind and its successors that had teachers focusing on not just on teaching math and English, because those were the only things that got tested, but on teaching a relatively narrow sliver of math and English skills that got tested at the expense of larger skills, so that students in English learn to read and analyze short passages of text at the expense of learning about novels or plays, learning how to write longer essays, and so on. And one sees that when one starts to teach students in college that their education in these subjects has been truncated to teach to the test. So that's one problem, then, is teaching to the test in the broader category of focusing on what gets measured. The other one I've already mentioned is how much time this often takes. And then there's the whole category of gaming the metrics in one way or another. So one of the most popular ways of doing that is by what we call creaming or cherry picking or selection bias. A couple of months ago, there was an article in the New York Times about a VA hospital in Oregon. I don't know if you read about it, where a number of emergency room physicians remonstrated with the leadership of this VA hospital. And when they didn't get any response, they were so desperate that they wrote to the New York Times, which came in and did an investigation of it. And it turned out that when older veterans came into the hospital, if they were really sick, including people who were dehydrated and so on, if they were really sick, a nurse on call there would call an administrator, and the administrator would often say, "Don't admit that person, send them to another hospital." And the motivation for this was to improve their metrics. There was a relatively new leadership of the hospital. They wanted to increase the number of stars that the hospital got on the VA public rating system, and the salary of the top administrators was tied in to improving the number of stars in these metrics.
Of course, because there are rewards.
Right.
There are rewards that are built in to this performance measure, and therefore everybody's moving in that direction in order to get that reward.
Right. So the idea was that you would mostly admit patients who weren't that sick. That would be good for your star rating because your mortality rates would be relatively low. And of course, that was at the expense of those people, those veterans who weren't admitted and had to go to some hospital some distance away and so on at some expense to their health. But the metrics of the hospital were improved, and the number of stars was improved, and the remuneration of the administrators were improved. So that's another example of this kind of metric dysfunction of creating it, of selecting the best cases.
When we read, Jerry, that so many people are dissatisfied with their work, I mean, they really are not happy, and in fact, it's bringing on lots of other mental, disorders because they are so distressed at work. And yet, you wrote that one of the key components of metric fixation is the belief that the best way to motivate people within these organizations is by attaching rewards and penalties to their measured performance. But that's not what motivates people, is it, really, inherently?
Right. So that's, of course, one of the key problems of this metric fixation is it's extremely simplified and one-sided and distorted conception of human motivation. I mean, on the one hand, we all are motivated to some degree or another by external motivation, by monetary motivation, or the desire for fame or whatever in terms of public rating. But in many organizations, especially in nonprofit organizations like schools and hospitals and others, people are also motivated in good part by intrinsic motivation. So they're interested in having work that is meaningful to them because of its intellectual or its physical complexity. They're interested in the social aspects of work, and above all, if it's a well-functioning nonprofit organization, they actually identify with the goal of the organization. So if they're a nurse or a doctor, they're actually interested in healing people. If they're teachers, they're interested in student learning. If they're policemen, they're interested in public safety. If you use this kind of metric fixation based on reward and punishment, it's monetary reward and punishment. So first of all, you're telling people that the things that really count are the things that we're rewarding, and the kinds of rewards that really count are monetary rewards. And in cases where people are actually motivated in good part by intrinsic motivation, because they identify with the purposes of the organization, that can lead to demoralization. That is, people went into the field of social work or government work or hospitals or whatever because they identified with some goal. Now you're telling them that what's really important is this particular thing that we're measuring. So sometimes intrinsic, and that is to say, intrinsic motivation and monetary motivation can go together in a positive way. So if the government, say Medicare, rewards a hospital for its safety record, well, that's in keeping actually with the intrinsic motivations of the people in the who work in the hospital. So sometimes the two things can go together, but often enough it works in the opposite way. And the notion that we should do everything for money has a demotivating effect on people who are primarily motivated by intrinsic motivation.
And folks, we will get to what we do need to measure, because Jerry Muller is not suggesting in this book about metrics, the tyranny of metrics, that we not measure anything. He's not saying throw all the numbers out, but we'll get into that. But I think if people really think about what you're saying, they might get through an example such as restructuring or layoffs. for example, that affect them directly. And they wonder, why did this have to happen? And we are reminded that sometimes it's just to make the company a more creative, a more attractive takeover target. And so they may be carnage that's left in the wake of these numbers. We've got to improve that bottom line so somebody will want to take us over. Or there may be a great product that a lot of people are benefiting from in the market, but if it's less profitable than, say, another by a factor of 5% or 10%, then that's taken off the market, and a lot of people, customers who use it, love it, are inconvenienced or worse as a result.
Yes, and that's very closely related to that is the problem of short-termism. That is to say, you try to improve the quarterly, literally the quarterly profits. So if the quarterly profits aren't what were projected at the beginning of the quarter, you lay off a bunch of staff. Well, that alienates people. It frightens people. It lowers your human capital. But it meets this short-term metric goal of profits, or as you say, with products that are actually profitable but not quite as profitable and are discontinued, what you might be doing is increasing the short-term profitability at the expense of the longer-term reputation of the company. So that's another problem with this kind of metric fixation is the tendency to focus on short-termism as opposed to the long-term interests of the company in positive images in the eyes of its clients, or in maintaining or enhancing its human capital, that it's making its employees more qualified, or in investing in R&D for long-term profits, even though that's cut into the short-term bottom line. That's another example of some of the dysfunctions of metric.
And Jerry, where is the pressure coming from for all of this? And how replete is this throughout our system, nonprofit, corporate, and is it generally coming from boards of directors, shareholders, money people who are investing in these companies, consultants? Where is the pressure to measure more and to use that as the sole indicator of success? Where is this pressure coming from?
So that's a really good question, the one that interested me in writing the book, because at a certain point, there's this perceived pressure to engage in metric fixation because that's what everybody does. So a businessman who may have made a lot of money and uses performance measures in his business then starts to contribute to a philanthropy. And he tells the philanthropy, well, I want to see your measured outcomes. And I'll give you more depending on those measured outcomes. And that leads the philanthropy to, first of all, have to spend a lot of money on measuring. And usually the philanthropist doesn't want to give them the money for measuring. Plus, it narrows the range of things that they do to the things that are measurable and so on. So part of it is, so there are different pressures in different fields. In public life and public policy, it often comes from politicians who see some sort of problem, which may be a real problem, like graduation rates of students in high school, or the low graduation rates from public colleges in their state. They see some problem, and then they assume that somehow this combination of measured performance, reward, and punishment, and publicizing the results is going to actually solve the problem, though it often doesn't. In the field of finance and of publicly traded corporations, the pressures are from a somewhat different direction, from investment companies that are responding sometimes to the individuals or to things like CalPERS, that is to say these big investment funds, pension funds, and they want to be able to show profitability all the time, every quarter. And they in turn put pressure then on the publicly traded firms in a way that often leads to this kind of short-termism. So it comes from different places, but I guess what interests me most is the way it's kind of in the air. At a certain point, people come to think that this is the way in which every organization should be run. And that idea is often also spread by consultants.
Well, you do remind us that at every point as managers in whatever kind of organization, that the best use of metrics at times may be not to use it at all, but you provide a checklist, ask for what kind of information are you thinking of measuring, how useful is the information, what are the costs of acquiring it, on and on. So you do give us a lot of guidance if we are going to use metrics. So in some sense, if you could summarize, if I was to ask you what a good blend of metrics and judgment might be, how would you respond to that?
Well, the first thing is to distinguish between metrics that are used for diagnosis by the practitioners themselves versus metrics that are used for reward and punishment by some outsider. So if a teacher is using some test to try to measure how much her students have learned, that's a perfectly legitimate diagnostic use of metrics. And you can take the measures of various teachers in a school, and the principal could convene them and say, why are some people doing better than others, and what might they learn from one another? Or is it just a matter of the difference of the quality of the students that they have? So if it's used, so when metrics are, when standardized measurement is used by the practitioners themselves, and especially if they develop the metrics and then they help to evaluate the metrics, then often the metrics go together with their sense of intrinsic purpose. So in that sense, metrics are really invaluable.
Well, thank you, Jerry Muller. I want to thank you so much for this book, The Tyranny of Metrics, and really walking us through this issue. And we're not going to get into how many people are going to listen to this podcast and measure your importance to us by virtue of that. If one person heard this and they are in a position to release us from this tyranny, then it would have been a good thing to have done. Thank you so much for coming by today on America Trends.
Thanks for inviting me, Larry.